Once upon a time, there was slavery, and it was bad. But then came Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves, and that was good. Unfortunately, the nation underwent a period called Jim Crow, which gave us separate but equal, and that was bad. But in 1954, the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education, and that was good. A year later, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus, and that was even better. Martin Luther King Jr. gave a series of stirring speeches that roused the nation's conscience and inspired people from across the land. In 1964, Congress acted boldly, passing legislation that allowed black people to eat in public places. A year later, Congress outdid itself and passed the Voting Rights Act, which allowed black people to vote. And despite some bumps along the way, we've all managed since that time to live happily ever after. See Obama Barack, 2008, 2012, the end.
Dug basically tunnels for railroads through mountains and everything, and it
basically worked where it was like a secret tunnel system, I guess you could say, where you have leaders like Harriet Tubman who led the slaves through the secret tunnel system.
Harriet Tubman had something to do with it.
Harriet Tubman?
Like Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman.
I know it was like used to free the slaves, and it was underground.
Harriet Tubman? Okay, solid.
The Underground Railroad was not a railroad under the ground. It was a network of safe houses used to harbor escaped slaves on their journey to freedom. It's considered one of the first major protests to slavery and the treatment of African Americans in the United States. In this case, underground referred to the secrecy of the operation, given that slavery was still the law of the land in the South. Railroad terminology was used to create a code for other conductors and slaves so that they could strategize in the presence of their masters and others that were pro-slavery. This code became especially vital after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which demanded all citizens had a legal obligation to return escaped slaves to their owners, even if they had already made it out of slave state territory. Leaders of the Underground Railroad were called conductors, and their primary role was maintaining a low profile while working with Quakers and abolitionists to communicate the safest routes for slaves to use to escape to freedom. These routes led to the northern states, Canada, Mexico, and even Cuba. Harriet Tubman is considered the face of the Underground Railroad, but there were many conductors. The father of the Underground Railroad is William Still, one of the earliest civil rights activists. American history often focuses on the key civil rights years in the 20th century, there's a common idea that there was no black resistance until Martin Luther King Jr. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who became the face of the abolitionist movement. His great literature and speeches helped to dispel the white argument that slaves were biologically incapable of being educated citizens and therefore should remain in bondage. He was the first African American to be nominated for Vice President of the United States on the Equal Rights Party ticket. His work was important for the Underground Railroad and the women's suffrage movement because his oratory skills provided for some the first exposure to an educated and charismatic African American, and for all, the concrete beginning of protesting inequality in our allegedly democratic government.
History of black colored Americans.
Oh, historic black colleges and universities.
It gave the African American population a place to go and like seek higher education because they'd been deprived that through kind of the conventional ways.
I've heard of her, but I honestly don't know.
So she was a journalist, right? And she documented like, I guess a lot of like the lynching and like that was going on. I do remember that one. I know that one.
I've never heard of that before.
I don't know what the Atlanta Compromise is.
No.
I don't know.
I'll be real.
I think it was I think it was Dubois who helped with that, and in exchange for education and due process, blacks would have to deal with Southern rule.
Early civil rights leaders in the creation of HBCUs sought to indirectly combat slavery and injustice through education rather than directly challenging Jim Crow laws. This led to organizations like the NAACP and highlighted key revolutionaries like Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Ida Wells was a journalist, women's rights advocate, and anti-lynching reformist. Before Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, Wells defied the 1875 Civil Rights Act that banned discrimination based on race, creed, or color in theaters, hotels, and transports like the Memphis train Wells was on when the conductor asked her to move to the segregated car. Immediately upon returning to Memphis, Ida Wells hired a lawyer to sue the railroad company. She won the local case, but the decision was overturned by the Supreme Court of Tennessee. Wells is just one of the early revolutionaries who sought to undermine the Jim Crow system way before MLK and the SCLC came along. Greats like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois became the voice of the last generation of former slaves as they navigated the Jim Crow South. Booker T. Washington gave his famous Atlanta Compromise speech, which highlighted the importance of education and entrepreneurship in the black community rather than trying to fight Jim Crow head-on. The Atlanta Compromise was an agreement which provided that the Southern blacks would work and submit to white political rule, while Southern whites would guarantee that blacks would receive basic education and economic opportunities. Du Bois was a civil rights activist and historian in the late 1860s. He was the co-founder of the NAACP and was a leader of the Niagara Movement, which sought to bring equal rights for blacks, and opposed Washington's Atlanta Compromise because Washington's plan provided that blacks would submit to white political rule.
Which president signed the Emancipation Proclamation? When did that happen? And what did it do?
It was Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln signed.
Don't look at me.
I don't know which president, but it abolished slavery. So it freed slaves, didn't it?
Abraham Lincoln. The way he said it kind of was supposed to like free the slaves, but I don't necessarily think that that's exactly what happened.
That was Abraham Lincoln, and it freed the slaves, but not everywhere though.
It freed the slaves in the Confederate territories, but that kind of didn't really mean.
So I was taught that it was like that's what freed slaves, but he issued it, and it was only meant to apply to slaves in the rebelling Confederacy states, and it was more of a political move.
Who won the Civil War? Not the Confederates, the Union, yeah.
Well, I guess I was taught the North won the Civil War.
The Union? I think is that a trick question? Like
the North, the country, America. We all did.
So, what was Reconstruction, and why did that have to happen?
So, Reconstruction was the period that took place right after the end of the Civil War, undertook measures including making sure different states adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in order to qualify to go back into the Union.
Despite the way history is most commonly taught, the Civil War was fought over slavery. Obviously, the South had ties to the economic benefits of slavery, and would fight to the bitter end to retain their right to own and exploit black people. So even after the Civil War, when Lincoln sent troops to occupy the South and ensure an end to slavery during the Reconstruction period, the Southern states found ways to codify their perceived superiority to black people through the Black Codes. These laws made it nearly impossible to thrive as a freed black person, and would more than likely result in black people being arrested and sent to jail. At this time, plantations could lease these black inmates to work on their plantations. So did slavery even really end with the Emancipation Proclamation? Lincoln and the North did not care about the welfare and human rights of black people, as Northern culture did not treat blacks as equal either. So why are we taught that Lincoln and the North ended slavery and were the saviors of black people?
What did the Supreme Court decide in Plessy versus Ferguson?
I'm not positive on this, but is it the one that where you have to return escaped slaves to their owners?
It was basically like separate but equal.
Plessy versus Ferguson was 10 to grade.
Separate but equal was kind of the law of the land, I think.
Ooh, Plessy versus Ferguson. That separate but equal was constitutional, because that was the one at the end of the 1800s, right? I think it had to do with trains. And he was actually like, it was all about like, had to do with blood quantum as well, and it was talking, like, he actually was like 5% like black. It was like something weird. Like he was like considered passing, but still like was denied those rights, and then he brought the case. But yeah, it laid the foundation for like new Jim Crow.
Where did segregation happen in the United States?
You mean specifically like in like the South and in like schools and all sorts of places like that?
Okay, so there was like legal segregation that happened the South, and there was like de facto segregation that happened in the North.
The South. Oliver. What was Jim Crow, and when was it a problem?
They were the laws used that helped to limit voting, I think.
It was a system of codes that basically said segregated, but in the law it was segregation. It wasn't like just de facto, and it was primarily in the South, and it was primarily in the 50s or up into the 50s and 60s, but there was still segregation laws in the North too.
We certainly do not learn enough about the Jim Crow era, other than the term Jim Crow and the fact that segregation happened. In the civil rights cases of 1883, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress has no power to regulate state and local matters involving commerce. The effect of this was that it invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which outlawed discrimination of public accommodations. Then, in 1896, the Supreme Court decided Plessy v. Ferguson, which would establish the legal basis for Jim Crow and jumpstart the racial apartheid in the South. More than creating the well-known separate but equal phrase, Plessy v. Ferguson created the basis for white supremacy in this country. Prior to this case, though discrimination had been violent and widespread, the law had never referred to Anglo-Americans as white. By giving all white people of diverse backgrounds and socioeconomic status power over black people, this case would allow a feeling of actual superiority among some of the worst off of white people in this country. No matter how poor you were, you would always be able to feel superior to black people.
That was the desegregation of schools, right? That's what that was. And then they ruled to desegregate, right? Was that the ruling?
Perfect. So I'm like trying to think. It was about the schools and how, you could have separate schools, or you could have separate schools but still be equal. And then also, I'm getting my history mixed up.
I remember like watching a video of like white people like spitting on like the little girls and little boys, the African Americans trying to get into school.
That they had to integrate schools, but it didn't say how quickly or how to do that.
Made Jim Crow like not a thing anymore, I guess.
Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, struck down Plessy versus Ferguson's separate but equal as unconstitutional, specifically in the public education system. Racial segregation in public schools confined blacks to an inferior place, both physically and metaphorically. The NAACP sought to use education to shift the paradigm and concluded that segregation in schools had negative repercussions and consequences for black self-esteem and black citizenship after being denied access to education. It was less about integrating blacks with whites, but more about opening access to traditionally white-dominated schools. However, it took 6 years from Brown v. Board's ruling for Ruby Bridges to attend an all-white elementary school alongside white students and federal marshals. However, the question remains, did school desegregation in all of its intentions actually desegregate schools? You see, school desegregation failed to actually integrate blacks into those most successful schools, because in 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus announced he would call in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the Little Rock Nine's entry to Central High School. Because of this, the Supreme Court had to rule yet again that states could not disagree with the unanimous Supreme Court decision to uphold Brown v. Board for the second time. All public schools had to desegregate at deliberate speed.
They only focus a lot in school on like Rosa Parks and like that she just sat down and then Martin Luther King was around.
Rosa Parks was involved, and it started when she did not give her seat up to a white person. She was thrown in jail, and she was held there for a while. Other than that,
Rosa Parks?
God, I don't want this to be wrong. Wasn't she the woman who sat in the back of the bus? Yeah, that's it. Okay. Right? Yeah, I don't know, maybe.
The misconception in the American education system is that the Montgomery bus boycotts was a result of Rosa Parks saying no and being arrested because of that. But in fact, her saying no was a part of the beginning of the boycotts.
The NAACP and like other organizers were really big, like had been planning like actions and planned Rosa Parks like action that day.
People refused to use the bus services and pay, like use the power of the purse type thing.
Rosa Parks was active in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and had attended Highlander Folk School, a citizenship school. Her relationship with Clifford Durr, a progressive white attorney, and his wife Virginia permitted Rosa to attend this school and other trainings that prepared her for her grand act of civil disobedience. E.D. Nixon was the former head of the NAACP in Montgomery and a prevalent civil rights leader. After scouting for the perfect person to start the boycott, he found Rosa Parks. At the time, buses and public transportation were segregated and blacks were made to sit in the back of the buses or to simply stand if there were no empty seats for whites. The plan was to have Rosa arrested for refusing to give her seat to a white man and to be convicted so that her case could be taken beyond local law enforcement, which, to put politely, was corrupted by segregationist politics. This massive economic boycott, where blacks refused to take any form of public transportation, lasted 13 months and ended with a Supreme Court case, Browder v. Gale, which ruled in favor of the movement. Segregation on buses was deemed unconstitutional. Among the Montgomery bus boycott's most important accomplishments was the networking and coalition building of ministers like Ralph Abernathy that led to the formation of the Montgomery Improvement Association and later the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It also signaled to the civil rights leaders that the strategy of nonviolence was the best approach in fighting for freedom. Perhaps the most important or recognizable outcome of this boycott was that confidence in Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership was affirmed by the success of the movement, and in many ways, this was when his national image and dedication to the movement emerged as a force to be reckoned with.
I know the sit-ins were, I want to say like southern states, like maybe like Texas.
Oklahoma?
The key figures in organizing the sit-ins were mainly college students, mainly in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Like the student I forgot that, coordinating committees that were nonviolent coordinating committees, maybe that was the name? Okay.
I'm not sure of the first thing, but they started in churches, right?
Okay, give me a second.
While the March on Washington is certainly the most recognizable mass demonstration from the civil rights movement, it would not have been possible without the work done largely by students in the South. The sit-ins marked the first direct action taken by civil rights activists because it involved black and white students going to all-white lunch counters, public cafeterias, and other segregated public spaces to sit down and non-violently protest segregation in the South. While the first sit-in was organized by James Farmer 20 years earlier, the South's first sit-in was organized by the Greensboro Four, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, students at North Carolina's A&T University. The idea was to have the students fill the seats of a restaurant or store, or in their case, the Woolworth's lunch counter, and politely and non-violently refuse to leave until they were served. The nonviolent techniques that had been successful in Montgomery were applied to the sit-ins, though the white reaction was often violent. It was during this time that the Nashville student movement began to pick up speed and organize sit-ins and protests from the campus of Fisk University in Nashville. The Nashville student movement was the start for numerous heroes of the civil rights movement, such as Diane Nash, James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, Marion Barry, and John Lewis. A crucial first step in organizing other students was maintaining a commitment to nonviolence, so the students would have all participants and demonstrators engage in nonviolence workshops led by James Lawson. James Lawson's work in the movement was invaluable. Years before the civil rights movement picked up steam, he went to India as a missionary and spent time studying Gandhi's nonviolent techniques. He returned to become a professor at Oberlin College in Ohio, but was quickly called upon to help lead the civil rights movement in Montgomery. His workshops in Nashville and across the South helped the students learn how to respond to violence and personal attacks with nonviolence and dignity. This helped to contrast the movement from the white violence they faced and hoped to provoke a larger response to the immorality of segregation. He took nonviolent techniques further by encouraging the students to not just sit in, but to be arrested and fill the jails, similar to Gandhi's technique during the Salt March. The sit-ins and work of students led to three key pieces of the civil rights movement. It showed that African Americans were not afraid of jail or white violence, created a network of student leaders that formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and reversed key segregation policies in public spaces that seemed out of reach even after the Brown v. Board ruling. Diane Nash even got Nashville Mayor Ben West to publicly admit that segregation was not morally right. Success from the sit-ins and organization of SNCC propelled the next phase of the civil rights movement with the Freedom Riders. In 1947, the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, organized the Journey of Reconciliation after the Supreme Court ruled in Morgan v. Virginia that interstate trains and buses could not be segregated. The idea then, as it was in 1961, was to test the federal law's practice in southern states that argued enforcing segregation was a state power and therefore had done nothing to desegregate. James Farmer and CORE organized the Freedom Rides in 1961. Black and white Freedom Riders would attempt to ride from D.C. to New Orleans and integrate the white-only facilities along the way. In May of 1961, 2 buses began the journey. after the first bus of Freedom Riders was firebombed in Anniston, Alabama, and the KKK, in conjunction with the Birmingham police, greeted and attacked the second bus, national attention fell on the Freedom Riders. Many of the Freedom Riders were seriously injured, but the resilient spirit of the movement emerged once again. Diane Nash, John Lewis, and other SNCC organizers quickly set out to finish the journey the Freedom Riders had started. They faced the terrorism of Bull Connor, but their perseverance ultimately prompted Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and President John F. Kennedy to federalize the Alabama National Guard to ensure their safe passage. This was an important step for the movement because it was affirmation that the Supreme Court and the federal government had chosen a side. And although their intervention would be complicated, it showed the country that equal rights and the historically hypocritical and unjust United States had a date with destiny. President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in July, but its progress was mostly related to stifling segregation. Bob Moses from SNCC began the voter registration and education initiative known as Freedom Summer in 1964 to help overcome the many barricades the black population in Mississippi faced in trying to register to vote. Black and white SNCC volunteers poured into Mississippi to open 41 freedom schools that would teach black citizens in rural Mississippi basic history and black history, which most had never learned, given Mississippi was polluted with the most severe systemic racial oppression in the U.S. Governor Ross Barnett had used the Citizens Council platform to protect white supremacy in nearly every institution, from education and housing to agriculture and the sharecropping economy. Freedom Summer sought to register black voters in order to have a more accurate representation in the government, given that the population was predominantly black, but in 1962, no blacks were registered to vote. After volunteers James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman disappeared at a traffic stop outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, national eyes again fell on SNCC's work in the South and the white violence they faced. Their bodies were found on August 4, 1964. Beyond increasing the number of black registered voters, Freedom Summer elected and sent its own, more representative delegate, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City and testified before the Credentials Committee to be seated. Lyndon B. Johnson's political agenda interfered with the broadcast of Fannie Lou Hamer's powerful testimony, and the MFDP was ultimately offered a less than desirable compromise. But the message had been sent. The work of Freedom Summer brought new meaning to grassroots activism and showed the nation that in spite of the Ross Barnetts and William Simmons in office, were real American heroes who would overcome national disenfranchisement because they had done so in Mississippi. SNCC continued their voter registration efforts throughout the South, but Selma, Alabama would become the next focus of the movement. When blacks would try to register to vote or gather lawfully outside of the courthouses, Sheriff Jim Clark and his army would use cattle prods and violence to push them away, or try to intimidate black voters by threatening to tell their employers what they were doing. The Dallas County Voters League invited Martin Luther King Jr. to come speak in Selma, though this made SNCC fear that their voter registration project would fade into the background of King's presence. After an impromptu night riot in Marion, Alabama, Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young black man trying to protect his mother from the police, was shot and killed. The death toll had reached a controversial limit for some SNCC organizers to feel comfortable with continuing their efforts, but 2 days after Jimmy Lee Jackson's death, the SCLC's James Bevel proposed a march from Marion to Montgomery. The first 50-mile march would be led by Hosea Williams of the SCLC, and despite SNCC's firm opposition, their council had decided that SNCC members could participate as independent agents. John Lewis joined Hosea Williams at the front of 600 people, standing 2 by 2 as they began the march. What happened as they attempted to peacefully cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge became known as Bloody Sunday. Police, armed and on horseback, viciously attacked the demonstrators in clouds of tear gas. Alabama Governor George Wallace and Sheriff Jim Clark had been notoriously extreme in their rejection of civil rights, but this was war. Despite the U.S. District's court order to delay another march, MLK and the SCLC decided to continue with the next march that became known as Turnaround Tuesday. As the marchers made it to the bridge, Martin Luther King Jr. kneeled and had Ralph Abernathy lead the group in prayer before turning the crowd around and ending the march. While this decision was widely criticized, he encouraged allies who had come down to Selma to participate to stay a few days longer. Reverends Miller, Olson, and James Reeb stayed to help, and as they left a restaurant a night later, they were attacked. James Reeb died from his injuries. The death of this white minister was the controversial tipping point for the federal government to intervene. President Johnson gave a speech that announced the new voting legislation he would introduce to Congress and also promised Black America, in their own words, that we as a nation shall overcome. The march from Selma to Montgomery was approved, and Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard to ensure their protection. Over 4,000 people from all over the country joined in the march that ended with King's promise that victory was near.
How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yes, how long? Not long. Not long. Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Yes, our God is marching on. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
While the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was monumental, it is commonly where American students stop learning about the civil rights movement. The motivation for this project was to provide a little more context to the quick and clean version of the civil rights movement that we're taught. The Disney version of events has become a dangerous part of the larger American narrative of race and politics. The problem with avoiding history that makes us uncomfortable is that it denies us the opportunity to understand the soul of America and breeds opportunity for history to repeat itself. Since the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the most powerful sections that protect minority representation, sections 4 and 5, have been repealed. Minority representation rights in the United States are more restricted now than they were in 1965. Mass incarceration and police brutality predominantly target the Black population and people of color, often resulting in their institutionalized disenfranchisement. In the words of Reverend William Barber II, this is our Selma now.
The time is in the street, you know, us living as we do upside down, and the new word to have is revolution. After all is said and done, build a new route to China if they'll have you. Who will survive in America? Who will survive in America? Who will survive in America? Who will survive in America?